So, how can you get someone's mean arterial pressure without actually having to insert something in them? You can actually measure their systolic and diastolic without having to actually puncture any of their vessels. And one way you can do that is by looking at this brachial artery and using this device right here. A BP cuff, or the more medical term for it is sphygmomanometer. So that's what we call our BP cuff. And if you go to most hospitals, these are like automatic, or even at like Longs or CVS or a pharmacy, they have those free blood pressure. You just stick your arm in that and the sleeve inflates and it automatically takes your blood pressure. But this is the way you can do it without any electronics. Or say you're living in a rural or serving a rural community, you might have to do it this way. You might have to do it the manual way and not have an automatic BP cuff. And what are you doing when you do this? Well, not only do you need this blood pressure cuff, you also need a stethoscope. And what you're going to listen for are something called Korotkoff sounds. And so you need that cuff to basically change. You're going to try to adjust the pressure in that cuff and see how, as you use a stethoscope against this artery, and see how the sounds in that artery change as you go through a continuum of pressures in that cuff. So this Korotkoff sounds, they sound like tapping or swishing. So you don't have them all the time. In fully open blood vessels, you don't hear these sounds. But as you're changing the blood pressure inside the cuff, then you're going to start hearing these sounds. So what causes these sounds? Well, what causes these sounds is something we call turbulence and laminar flow. What we see here is that, notice that the flow through this vessel completely smooth. Nothing is disturbing it. So laminar flow should not have a sound. But what we have with turbulence is that, notice that the currents and the flow of liquid through here, this is causing all these eddies, and due to the movement and this kind of rough movement throughout this narrow tube, this is going to cause the swishing sounds you hear during those Korotkoff sounds. Now, I know a lot of you are probably like, okay, I'm not sure what this means. Like, how does turbulence make noise? Here's another analogy. Which would make more noise? A nice, smoothly flowing lake river like this, or rapids? Yeah, notice that, what's the difference? Well, notice that the flow is very smooth in this example, whereas the flow over here, notice that it's churning up all this white froth. Which makes more noise? The rapids, if you've ever been to any river or stream that has these kind of like rapids right here, it makes a lot of noise. Or how about a stream that's flowing like this versus a waterfall? All that crashing water is going to cause noise. So turbulence equals noise. What about a smooth flight versus turbulence during a flight? Yeah, if you've been on a turbulent flight, you notice that all the air kind of like, so during a regular flight without turbulence, you don't hear this big noise and you don't have all that bumping and movement because the air is flowing smoothly across the wings. But what happens if the air gets turbulent around the airplane? That's going to cause the air to knock around the airplane, cause all this noise, cause the airplane to jump around. So turbulence causes noise. Okay, so how does that relate to blood pressure? You inflate that sphygmomanometer past what you expect someone's systolic pressure to be, and then you slowly, so if you had your blood pressure taken that way, you might notice that they inflate the cuff and it feels like something's really squeezing the life out of your arm, and then they release the valve and they start to let the air out, and notice that the pressure starts to ease over time. So this line up here represents the pressure inside that cuff, and this red line that goes up and down, that represents the pressure inside that artery. Now notice that the pressure inside the artery is reaching a diastolic lower volume or lower pressure, and also reaching that higher systolic pressure. So again, systole, squeezing of the heart, and the diastole, the relaxation of the heart. Now, but notice that at this point, the blood pressure cuff has a higher pressure than even the highest pressure inside of the vessel. So the cuff pressure is greater than the vessel's pressure. So what's that going to do? That's going to collapse the artery. So when you have a collapsed artery and you have this blood pressure cuff with the higher pressure squeezing on that artery, no blood is going to flow through. If there's no blood flowing through, there's no sounds because there's no turbulence. It's like if those rivers dried up completely. Would you hear anything? No, because there's nothing flowing through them. So what we have here, there's no sounds quite yet. So the artery is closed off because the cuff pressure is greater than the artery pressure. Now, what do we have here? Well, notice that now the cuff pressure is starting to fall within the range of the systolic and diastolic. So what's happening here? Because the pressure is not, so at these parts right here, where the arterial pressure is greater than blood cuff pressure, this is going to cause it to be open at certain times. So it's like basically, it's like the vessels are going to be slightly constricted, but not completely shut off like when the cuff was completely inflated. So now these vessels are partially open, but by being partially open, this causes turbulence. By causing turbulence, this causes these sounds. So whenever these vessels are partially open, when the pressure inside the arteries is greater than the cuff pressure, this causes a sound every time that occurs. Now, what happens when the pressure inside the arteries is greater than the cuff pressure? Well, now notice that even when the arteries are fully relaxed, there's more pressure inside the arteries than inside the cuff. Because the pressure inside the arteries is greater than the pressure inside the cuff at this point, the arteries are fully open, therefore there's no sounds because notice that the flow is completely smooth. So this is an interesting thing. Systolic blood pressure is where you first hear these tapping sounds or tapping sounds. Because why? Because now you start to cause turbulence when these two when you have this systolic pressure slightly higher than this the blood pressure cuff pressure. But at this point, so notice that these sounds occur every time you have the systole, and then when you reach this point, notice that these sounds disappear. And why is that? Well, you don't have the turbulence anymore. So when you first hear the sounds, that's systolic. When it's diastolic, that's the last sound you hear. So when the sounds disappear, that's when you take your diastolic reading. Now, what do these sounds sound like? I'm going to link to a video where you can listen to the sounds and hear that tapping, and then it actually goes from this tapping to this kind of swishing, and then back to a tapping sound. So again, when you first hear the sounds, that's when you have your systole, and when you have stopped hearing those sounds and they disappear, that's the diastolic pressure.